Mr. Martin smiled gently, the kind of smile that didn't belong to a superstar but to a man who'd seen enough life to recognize a fragile moment when it appeared. "You're not in the way," he said softly. "You just look like two people who deserve something better than tears on a wedding night." Catherine tried to speak, but her voice caught. Thomas straightened his shoulders, embarrassed, protective. "We're getting married," he said quietly, like an apology. "Just keeping it simple." Dean nodded, as if that explained everything. "Simple's fine," he said, "but simple doesn't have to be silent." He asked where the ceremony was being held, and when Thomas pointed toward the chapel upstairs, Dean glanced at his watch. "Plenty of time." Without another word, he gestured for them to follow him. They hesitated, unsure if this was real or some cruel Vegas illusion, but something in Dean's calm certainty made them move. When they reached the small chapel, the justice of the peace looked up, confused, as Dean Martin stepped inside a room barely large enough to hold 10 chairs. The air changed instantly, not because of fame, but because of presence. Dean took off his jacket, draped it over the back of a chair, and looked at the couple. "Mind if I sit in for a minute?" he asked. Thomas nodded, still stunned. Catherine's hands were shaking. Dean leaned toward the justice of the peace and whispered something. The man's eyes widened, then softened. He nodded and stepped back. Dean turned to Thomas and Catherine. "I hear you wanted music," he said. Catherine let out a small, broken laugh. "It's okay," she said quickly. "We know that costs extra." Dean shook his head. "Not tonight." He stood, took one step closer to them, and without any introduction, without any announcement, he began to sing. No microphone, no band, just Dean Martin's voice filling a tiny chapel meant for paperwork and quick vows. He sang "Everybody Loves Somebody," slow and intimate, as if the song had been written for two nervous kids with no money and too much love. Catherine broke completely, tears streaming down her face. Thomas couldn't look at her, because if he did, he knew he'd lose control. Mary, Catherine's sister, stood frozen near the back wall, her hand covering her mouth, afraid to breathe in case the moment shattered. When Dean finished, there was no applause. There shouldn't have been. He stepped aside and nodded to the justice of the peace. "Go ahead," he said. "They're ready." The ceremony continued, but nothing about it was ordinary anymore. When Thomas said his vows, his voice no longer shook. When Catherine spoke, she smiled through her tears, and when they were pronounced husband and wife, Dean clapped first, soft and genuine, like a proud uncle who'd just witnessed something sacred. As they signed the papers, Dean reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded envelope. He placed it quietly on the table. "For the honeymoon," he said. Thomas tried to refuse. "Sir, we can't." Dean cut him off gently. "You're not taking it for me," he said. "You're taking it for the man you'll be when things get hard. You'll remember tonight, and you'll remember that kindness shows up when you least expect it." He picked up his jacket, gave Catherine a small bow, and headed for the door. "Congratulations," he said. "Take care of each other." "Hey," was gone before anyone could stop him, before security arrived, before reality could catch up. Downstairs, the crowd at the Sands roared as Dean Martin walked back on stage at 9 p.m., glass in hand, cool as ever. They never knew that minutes earlier. He had sung the purest song of his life to an audience of 4. Thomas and Catherine Reynolds stayed married for 48 years. When money was tight, they talked about that night. When arguments felt too heavy, they talked about that night. When Thomas worked double shifts and Catherine graded papers until midnight, They talked about that night. They raised children who grew up hearing the story not as a celebrity encounter, but as proof that the world sometimes reaches back when you're on the edge of giving up. At their 40th anniversary, their grandson asked why they'd never renewed their vows in a big ceremony. Cather smiled and said, "Because we already had music." And when Thomas passed away years later, Catherine kept one photo on her nightstand. Not of the wedding kiss, not of the cake, but of two young people standing in a chapel they could barely afford, remembering the night a stranger saw their tears and decided they mattered. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about what he did on June 12, 1972. No interviews, no stories. But the people whose lives he touched carried it forward. Because sometimes the greatest performances don't happen under bright lights. Sometimes they happen in quiet rooms with no applause, where one person chooses to stop, to notice, and to give something priceless to people who never thought they'd be seen. Dean Martin walked out of that chapel as quietly as he had entered, but the room he left behind would never be the same. For a long moment after the door closed, no one spoke. The justice of the peace stared at the spot where Dean had been standing, as if expecting him to reappear. Mary clutched the back of the wooden chair, just to steady herself. Thomas and Catherine stood there, holding each other, married now, stunned, their hearts pounding, trying to understand how an ordinary Tuesday night had turned into something unreal. Finally, the justice of the peace cleared his throat and said softly, "Well, I don't think I'll ever top that." It broke the spell just enough for everyone to laugh through tears. Catherine wiped her cheeks and whispered, "Did that really just happen?" Thomas nodded slowly. "Yeah," he said, his voice thick. "And nobody is ever going to believe us." They took a few photos with Mary's cheap disposable camera, hands still shaking. There was no grand reception, no crowd waiting outside, no applause, just a quiet hallway, a buzzing elevator, and the sound of slot machines drifting up from the casino floor. As they stepped into the elevator, Catherine looked down at her simple dress and smiled. "I don't care if we never have anything else," she said. This was perfect. Thomas squeezed her hand. "We didn't just get married," he said. "We got a miracle." Downstairs, the Sands showroom was already roaring. Dean Martin walked back on stage at exactly 9 p.m., glass in hand, tuxedo crisp, the king of cool once again. The audience had no idea where he'd been. They did then. No, that minutes earlier he'd turned a quiet chapel into something sacred. They just saw Dean Martin smile, tell a joke, and launch into his opening song like nothing unusual had happened. That was the magic of him. He could give something extraordinary away and never ask the world to notice. Thomas and Catherine used that $100 exactly the way Dean told them to. They went to a fancy steakhouse they'd never have dared to enter before. They shared one steak, 2 glasses of wine, and talked about the moment over and over again, afraid that if they stopped talking about it, it might disappear. That night became their anchor. Every hard year, every tight paycheck, every argument, every fear, they came back to that chapel and that song. They stayed married for nearly 50 years. When Thomas worked long construction hours and Catherine graded papers late into the night, they'd joke, "Hey, we've already peaked." Dean Martin sang at our wedding. When money was tight, Catherine would say, "Remember what he said. Love is enough." When Thomas got sick years later and was afraid, Catherine would hold his hand and whisper, "Everybody loves somebody sometime," and he would smile every time. Their grandson didn't hear the full story until his 20s. When he finally did, he asked his grandmother why she'd never tried to track Dean Martin down, never written a letter, never told the press. Catherine shook her head. That moment wasn't for the world, she said. It was for us. Dean didn't do it to be remembered. He did it because he saw two scared kids who needed kindness. Dean Martin never mentioned that wedding in interviews. There was no photograph, no headline, no proof it ever happened. But the Sands hotel staff talked about it for decades. Bellman whispered about it. Chapel workers passed it down like folklore. That's the room, they'd say. That's where Dean Martin sang for free. And that's the part of the story people miss when they talk about legends. Dean Martin didn't just fill stadiums. He filled moments. He didn't just entertain crowds. He saw individuals. And on June 12, 1972, he looked at two broke kids in love and decided they deserved something beautiful. Not because they were important, but because they were human. That wedding didn't make headlines, but it made a marriage stronger. It shaped a family. It echoed across generations. And 50 years later, when their grandson tells the story, he always ends it the same way. Dean Martin didn't just sing at my grandparents' wedding. He taught them, and all of us, that magic doesn't belong to the rich or the famous. Sometimes it just shows up when love needs a witness. And that's where Catherine had to stop for a moment. She pressed a hand to her chest, overwhelmed, then continued. She told the room that, in that moment, standing in the Sands Chapel with nothing but 10 wooden chairs and a borrowed suit and a dress that cost less than Dean's tie, she realized something that stayed with her for the rest of her life. Kindness doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't have to be announced. It doesn't need witnesses. The most powerful kindness is the kind you give quietly when no one is watching, simply because you can. Dean Martin didn't change their lives by being famous. He changed their lives by being human. Thomas nodded beside her and said that for years, whenever life got hard, whenever money was tight, whenever they felt tired or discouraged, they would look at each other and say, "Remember the chapel?" That was their shorthand for remembering that one unexpected act of generosity could echo forever. When Thomas lost his job in the 1980s and they were scared about paying the mortgage, they remembered the chapel and kept giving anyway. When Catherine was diagnosed with cancer years later and survived, they remembered the chapel and volunteered at the hospital, sitting with strangers who had no one. When their children struggled, when their grandchildren stumbled, the lesson was always the same. You don't wait to be rich to be generous. You don't wait to be important to matter. Michael told the room that after hearing the story, he finally understood something about his grandparents that had always puzzled him. They never talked about success. They never chased recognition. They never cared about status. All they cared about was whether they had made someone's day a little lighter, someone's burden a little easier. And now he knew why. Because 50 years earlier, a man who had everything had stopped for two people who had nothing and treated them like they mattered. The room sat in silence for a long time after Thomas and Catherine finished. No one rushed to clap. No one checked their phones. People were thinking about their own lives, their own chances to be kind that they might have missed, or might still have. Finally, someone near the back of the room stood up and began applauding slowly. Then another. Then the entire room rose to its feet, not cheering, not celebrating, but honoring something rare and beautiful. Later that night, after the party ended, Michael asked his grandparents one final question. "Do you think Dean Martin ever knew what he started. Catherine smiled softly and shook her head. No, she said, and that's what makes it perfect. Thomas added, if he'd known, it wouldn't have been the same. He didn't do it to change the world. He did it because it felt right in that moment. Dean Martin never spoke publicly about the wedding. There's no interview, no quote, no footage. But somewhere between his 7 p.m. show and his 9 p.m. show on June 12, 1972, he stepped into a quiet chapel and gave to strangers a gift that outlived him. Not a song, not $100, but a way of living. And that's why this story matters. Not because Dean Martin was famous, not because it happened in Las Vegas, but because it proves something simple and powerful. One act of kindness, done quietly, can ripple outward for decades. It can shape families, values, futures. It can turn two broke kids into 50 years of generosity. Dean Martin walked back on stage that night and sang 2000s. But the most important performance of his life was sung to an audience of 3 in a small chapel with no spotlight and no applause. And 50 years later, that song was still playing. That's real love, real generosity, and the kind of quiet goodness that changes the world without ever asking for applause. After the anniversary party, the story escaped the small circle that had protected it for 50 years and found its way into the light. Michael shared it online, never expecting much. But within days, it exploded, passed from stranger to stranger like a reminder people didn't know they needed. Journalists followed. Historias dug. Former Sands employees came forward with memories that suddenly made sense. An old security guard, nearly 90, remembered seeing Dean return to the showroom that night before his 9 p.m. set, humming softly to himself. Lighter than usual, smiling in a way that felt different. When asked if he was all right, Dean had simply said he'd remembered why he got into show business in the first place. A concierge recalled the chapel coordinator coming down in disbelief, insisting Dean Martin had just sung at a wedding upstairs. A story nobody believed at the time, and that quietly became hotel folklore. But for Thomas and Catherine Reynolds, it was never folklore. It was the foundation of their lives. In her final interview before she passed, Catherine said if she could speak to Dean one last time, she wouldn't talk about the song or the money or the miracle of the moment. She would thank him for seeing them when they felt invisible, for choosing kindness over convenience, for walking away from fame and lights to stand in a small room with 2 scared kids and treat them like they mattered. She said they spent 50 years trying to live up to that example, not because they were special, but because someone once showed them what was possible. The chapel is gone, the Sands is gone, and Dean Martin is gone. But the ripple of what happened on June 12, 1972 is still moving through the world, quietly shaping lives in ways no headline could ever measure. That is the real legacy. Not the records, not the movies, not the legend of cool, but the moments no one was supposed to see. Because real generosity isn't loud, and real love doesn't announce itself. Sometimes it just steps into a room, sings from the heart, and leaves behind a lifetime of goodness. And sometimes, if we're paying attention, it reminds us that everybody loves somebody, and every once in a while, somebody loves everyone.